Hello class, in this lecture we'll be looking at Hellenistic and Roman philosophy through the lens of Neoplatonism. This lecture will cover Pierre Hadot on philosophical schools in the imperial period, as well as the figure of Plotinus, according to Porphyry's Life of Plotinus and three of Plotinus's Enneads. And lastly, we'll be covering Neoplatonic Theurgy, or magic, looking to both the hymns of Proclus and to the Chaldean oracles. I've also included in the course pack as options for this week the letter to Marcella, Porphyry's wife, and one of the first, if not the first, text of literary criticism in the ancient world, Porphyry's On the Cave of the Nymphs. Of all the schools of Hellenistic antiquity we've covered, Neoplatonism is probably the most complicated, because of its influence on later Christianity, the best preserved. The term itself, Neoplatonism, is a modern term that 19th century scholars created in order to distinguish the ideas of later Greek and Roman Platonists from those of Plato. It's a problematic and highly contested term, since Neoplatonism's main authors didn't consider themselves as newfangled Platonists, rather as legitimate inheritors of Plato. It's probably more accurate to speak, after the death of Plato, of early, middle, and late Platonism. After late Platonism, that is, thinkers like Proclus and eventually Philoponus, Neoplatonic approaches continued to be of tremendous importance in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic mysticism and theology, as well as in esoteric traditions. The four main characters of Neoplatonism are Plotinus, Porphyry, Iamblichus, and Proclus. There are many other less well-known names we'll cover briefly here. And the influence of Neoplatonic thought on the subsequent history of philosophy is enormous, including figures like Augustine of Hippo, Hypatia, Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, Avicenna, Paracelsus, Marsilio Ficino, Pico, Raphael, Thomas Taylor, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and many others have been associated with Neoplatonism or Neoplatonic thought. For informative Neoplatonic videos online, I recommend the BBC Neoplatonism in Our Time session. Manly P. Hall's lectures are a bit dated, but still lots of fun. The best podcast resource for studying Neoplatonism is certainly Earl Fontenelle's amazing Schweppes series, The History of Western Esotericism, which has many excellent episodes on Plato, Middle and Late Platonism. As Hadot reminds us, four major schools in this period were Platonism, Aristotelianism, Stoicism, and Epicureanism. However, all of them, except the school of the Epicureans, disappeared at the end of the Roman Republic, or the beginning of Empire, and this is often dated to Sulla's sack of Athens in 87 BC. Subsequent to this, schools opened throughout the Roman Empire, not just in Athens. However, by the 3rd and 4th century, Epicureanism and skepticism gradually disappeared almost completely with the advent of Neoplatonism, which was most simply a fusion of Aristotelianism and Platonism. Plotinus often gets the credit for being the first reviver of Platonism after its relative dark age, characterized by the control of the Platonic Academy by academic skeptics. But this is inaccurate. The Platonic Academy under Antiochus of Ascalon tried to move the school away from academic skepticism, and there were many precursor figures in the development of so-called Neoplatonism. The rise of Neoplatonism was fueled in part by a change in the institutional character of teaching philosophy and its increasing control by government organizations. Some elements of this existed already in the 2nd century BCE, but municipal philosophical education, paid for by the city, tends to become more and more common in the imperial period. And this movement reached its apogee and consecration when, in 176 AD, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius founded 4 imperial chairs in philosophy. That is, for the teaching of the 4 traditional doctrines. Hadot notes that these chairs had no continuity with ancient Athenian institutions. Instead, they were an attempt by the emperor to re-establish Athens as a center of philosophical culture. Private professors during this period also opened schools in other parts of the empire, most importantly for Neoplatonism, Ammonius Saccas in Alexandria, Plotinus in Rome, and Iamblichus in Syria. From the 4th to the 6th century CE, the Neoplatonic school of Athens was under the leadership of Plutarch of Athens, not to be confused with Plutarch, the writer of biographies, followed by Syrianus and Proclus. These institutions were kept afloat by subsidies from wealthy pagans. By the 3rd century CE, the Platonic schools had succeeded in resuscitating the organization of the old academy. In ancient times, the scholars of the school had called themselves diadoches or diadoches, which means successors of Plato, and the members of the school had tried to live in the Pythagorean and Platonic way of life. After an interruption of about a century, the Neoplatonists did not so much continue as recreate tradition that they supposed to be alive and uninterrupted. Such a situation called for a return to the sources, that is, to the close exegetical commentary on the dialogues of Plato and the treatises of Aristotle. The teaching of orthodoxy, that is the correct way to interpret these two ancient masters above all, became paramount. Already in the 2nd century CE, the Platonist Taurus was teaching in Athens. He used to recall nostalgically the discipline which prevailed in primitive Pythagorean communities, posing this discipline to the attitude of modern disciples, who he lamented wanted to decide for themselves the order in which they will learn philosophy. Very few fragments of Taurus's thoughts survive. This one, on the correct course of education in Plato, is quite humorous and still seems fairly accurate today. This student here is burning to begin with Plato's Symposium because of the orgy of Alcibiades, and this other one with the Phaedrus because of the speech by Lysias. There are even some who want to read Plato, not in order to make their lives better, but in order to adorn their language and their style, not in order to become more temperate, but in order to acquire more charm. The Platonists, learning philosophy meant learning to read Plato. And so Hadot comments that from a certain point of view, we can see this period as one which saw the birth of the age of the professors. What is so peculiar about many of the Neoplatonists is their combining of the way of life of ancient sages with the new necessities of scholastic exegesis and orthodox doctrine. Plotinus, Porphyry, Iamblichus, and Proclus still seem very far to us from the image of a modern professor, not least because at least the latter three were deeply involved in magic and religion. But from another point of view, their approach to ancient texts was indeed scholastic and professorial. At the core of Neoplatonic thought, truth is considered as already revealed in Plato's dialogues. The task would be to nurture the sparks of logos and fundamental truths to the level of scientific discourse. Plato reveals to us the world as it actually is. And like Plato, the Neoplatonists augmented Platonic truths with what the Greeks have always believed, namely that the gods make revelations to a few inspired mortals, where this process goes back to the origin of various human communities, and where these privileged mortals, revealers of divine truth, might be legislators like Solon, poets like Hesiod or Orpheus, or philosophers like Pythagoras. Plato did not so much invent his philosophy, but he inherited it and refined it into a more systematic form from the ancient sages, philosophers, and law founders. The Neoplatonists thus revered the entire Greek religious and philosophical tradition as a unity, which included the truthful revelations of poetry, such as Hesiod's Theogony and Homer, as well as the historical and cosmological narratives in Plato's Timaeus. And there was additionally in Neoplatonism a constant effort of return to the origins of tradition, from Plato back to Pythagoras, from Pythagoras back to Orpheus, and from poetic religion back to the oracles of the gods in their various sanctuaries, and from all this forward through the continuing unbroken lineages of divine revelation, such as the 2nd century CE Chaldean oracles. For them, philosophy speaks in the language of conceptual clarity, that is, participation in the form. Myth, religion, and poetry, however, speak in the language of allegory. Students of Neoplatonic schools learned philosophy by commenting on texts in ways that was highly technical and highly allegorical. Say something sublime or symbolic by means of something else. From the Greek allegoresis. According to Plutarch, Plato and Aristotle brought philosophy to its culmination in what is called epoptics, the supreme revelation of transcendent reality, becoming one of those who have seen beatific vision and fathomed the truth at the heart of the world, as in the mysteries. Like in other schools of the period, philosophy was divided into three main branches: ethics, which ensured the soul's purification; physics, which revealed that the world has a transcendent cause and encouraged philosophers to seek for incorporeal realities; and lastly, metaphysics or theology, which, like the mysteries, aims at initiation and ultimately the contemplation of God. On the order in which we should study Plato, they mainly cohered that we should begin with the moral dialogues, first to learn to know oneself in the Alcibiades, and next to learn to detach ourselves or soul from the body in the Phaedo. Next up comes the physical dialogues, such as Plato's Timaeus, in order to learn how to transcend the sensible world. The most difficult of Plato's dialogues, from which most of the core teachings of Neoplatonism are derived, include the theological and metaphysical ones, like the Parmenides or the Philebus, whose aim is to discover the one and the good. In accordance with this system, when Porphyry arranged Plotinus's treatises, he did so not according to the chronological order of their appearance, but to the stages of spiritual progress in the Platonic curriculum. So Plotinus' first Ennead contained treatises of an ethical nature, the second and third Plotinus' physical doctrines, and the fourth, fifth, and sixth Enneads discussed the soul, the intellect, and the one, and corresponded to epoptics, or ultimate initiation. In way of life, Neoplatonism was largely a revival of the Pythagorean tradition. The adepts ate no meat, practiced an ascetic way of living in the hope of a better fate in the next life. Beginning approximately in the Christian period, an entire apocryphal Pythagorean literature emerged. And this was the period in which the famous Golden Verses of Pythagoras was composed, one of few short texts from the ancient world you can find in tourist editions across Greece even today. Many biographies or lives of Pythagoras were produced, most important being by Porphyry and Iamblichus. The idyllic philosophical life led in the master's school was exalted, and the organization of Pythagorean community was emulated. The way of life which Porphyry and Plotinus recommend was, like in Aristotle's school, living in accordance with the mind, or nous. That is, the highest part of the self, or soul, the intellect. The Neoplatonists, however, drew a strong distinction between living in accordance with the mind and pure reason, or discourse. Reason is just a part of intellectual contemplation, or theoria. For Porphyry, the theoretic way of life does not consist in an accumulation of ratiocinations or in the volume of acquired knowledge. It is not built up in a piecemeal way. It requires a transformation of consciousness and an intuitive vision. This was also a theme in Aristotle. It is not enough to acquire knowledge. Our knowledge must become nature within us and grow along with us. Philosophy is a kind of nostalgia, a longing for home, that is a return to our true nature through the Ascent. Our true selves or true natures are only accessible through connaturality, or the symphysis, that is, along with physis, through which we do not assimilate anything other than our true selves. Our true self, however, is the spirit, and the goal we seek is to live in accordance with the spirit. Exactly how soul or self and spirit are related in the various Neoplatonists, however, will be a more complicated matter. Porphyry, the type of life appropriate to the philosopher, involves detachment from sensation, imagination and the passions, a control of the body or ascetics, and a withdrawal from the frenzied crowd or herd. The goal of philosophy is to undergo a union or theosis with the intellect, or deepest spirituality of God beyond the cosmos. Porphyry writes the goal and end consisted of union with the supreme deity and the process of drawing closer to him. The intellect, or the intelligence, is divine. The supreme deity is established even above the intellect and the intelligible. The most simple designation is the ineffable one. Porphyry asserts that Plotinus achieved the goal of union with the supreme deity 4 times during the 6 years in which he attended his school. And Porphyry himself, writing at the age of 68, tells us he attained it only once in his lifetime. As Hadot comments, such experiences, which we could call mystical or unitive, were thus very rare. On such initiatory experiences of theosis, Plotinus himself writes, "When the soul has the good luck to meet him, he comes to her, better yet, when he appears to her as present, when she turns away from all other things present, having prepared herself in order to be as beautiful as possible, and when she has thus achieved resemblance with him, seeing him suddenly appear within her, then the soul is no longer conscious of her body, nor that she is in this body, and she no longer says that she is something other than him, not man, nor animal, nor being, nor all." Here the human soul is thought in the feminine, much like in Christian traditions of theosis, or even the Shekinah of Jewish Kabbalism, the bridegroom or sacred marriage experience of the divine. On Plotinus's ineffable experience, Hadot comments, the tone and atmosphere here are relatively new in the history of philosophy. For here, philosophical discourse is used only to indicate, without expressing that which transcends it. That is to say, an experience in which all discourse is annihilated, and in which there is no longer any individual self-consciousness, but only a feeling of joy and presence. This emphasis on the ineffable experience as a goal of philosophy indeed goes back to Plato's Symposium and its beauty of wonderful nature, which is nothing other than the good itself, and also to the mysteries of Eleusis. Plato states clearly that such a vision constitutes the point at which life is worth living. And well before the rise of Neoplatonism, we find this Platonic tradition strongly expressed in Philo of Alexandria, when he writes, "When a person's intellect is seized by divine love, when it strives with all its might to arrive at the most secret sanctuary. When the person surges ahead with all his force and all his zeal, transported by the deity, he forgets everything and forgets himself. He remembers only the deity and is suspended from him. But when his enthusiasm fades and desire loses its fervor, he becomes a human being once again. He leaves divine things behind and then encounters the human things which wait for him in the vestibule of the temple. This emphasis on the philosophical value of divine enthusiasm in the Platonic dialogues is already expressed well before the Neoplatonists in Philo of Alexandria. It is a common misunderstanding that this emphasis on philosophical inspiration is peculiar to the mystical Plato versus the more scientific Aristotle. In fact, we find a similar tendency in Aristotelianism when it teaches that human happiness consists in contemplation, whose supreme object is the thought of thoughts, or the nous, divine mind, thinking itself. And the great Aristotelian commentator Alexander of Aphrodisias interestingly develops this mystical Aristotelianism with his concept of the union of our intellect with the divine intellect. Let's turn now to the life and teachings of Plotinus of Alexandria, considered the foremost exponent of Neoplatonism and who founded an important school to teach its doctrine in Rome. Other than the writings of Plato and the Pythagoreans, most significant influences on Plotinus were his teacher Ammonius and Philo of Alexandria. Porphyry, in his biography Life of Plotinus, begins by calling him the philosopher of our time, the philosopher of our contemporary. The Stephen McKenna translation, or the philosopher of our time, seemed ashamed of being in a body. So deeply rooted was this feeling that he could never be induced to tell of his ancestry, his parentage, or his birthplace. When asked to sit still for a sculptor, he quipped, "Is it not enough to carry about this image in which nature has enclosed us? Do you really think I must also consent to leave as a desired spectacle to posterity an image of the image?" This might just be the best excuse for being camera-shy of all time. The death and last words of Plotinus could be the subject of an entire book of allegorical interpretation. His last words upon the arrival of his friend, "I have been a long time waiting for you. I am striving to give back the divine in myself to the divine in the all." In other words, it's time to give the gift back to the giver and no longer live on borrowed time. As he spoke, a snake crept under the bed on which he lay and then slipped away into a hole in the wall at the same moment Plotinus died. Serpents in ancient Greek religion and temple cult are ubiquitous. Most major Greek deities have a serpent or chthonic aspect. The symbolism of the serpent here is the mortal coil or body of Plotinus under the bed upon which lies the dying philosopher. The path of the soul of Plotinus, like the soul of Socrates in the Phaedo, is perhaps at once down into the chthonic and up into the noetic realm. The snake does not slough off his skin or continue to hide under the bed at the moment of the philosopher's death, but rather slips away into a hole in the wall, concealing itself like Physis or the proverbial writing on the wall. And perhaps this indicates that of all philosophers, Plotinus averted the danger of death and reincarnation, ascending back to his celestial home. Porphyry believes he is able to fix the date of Plotinus's birth to around 204 to 205 CE, but he never disclosed the month or day, and this because he didn't want his disciples to make him a birthday party or a feast, although Porphyry notes he had no such qualms about sacrificing on the traditional birthdays of Plato and Socrates. Regarding the early life of Plotinus, almost nothing is known, but Porphyry relates an interesting anecdote of the philosopher being weaned late. For at the age of 8, he was already going to school and still clung about his wet nurse and loved to bear her breasts and take suck. One day he told he was a perverted imp and so was shamed out of the trick. I imagine many a psychoanalytic reading of Plotinus's thought has made much of this interlude. It wasn't until 27 that he was caught with a passion for philosophy. He found the most highly reputed professors in Alexandria be saddening and discouraging. A friend who knew him well suggested Ammonius. When Plotinus heard him lecture, he exclaimed, "This is the man I was looking for." Plotinus studied 11 years under Ammonius, along with other notable disciples, and during this period also studied Persian and Indian philosophy, and went on an expedition in the campaign against Persia. He was nearly killed in Mesopotamia, but made it off safe to Antioch. At 40, under the reign of Philip, settled in Rome. Most scholars distinguish the Origen, who also studied under Ammonius with Plotinus, the early church father and Christian author, but this is still debated. All three made a pact never to reveal Ammonius's secret doctrines. Was, according to Porphyry, the only one to keep the pact. Scholars continue to debate the influence of Ammonius in Plotinian thought. As to his teaching style, Porphyry indicates it was thoroughly dialectical, putting questions to his listeners. In a more informal way, which Porphyry notes disapprovingly, led to a great deal of wandering and idle chatter. He did not write for a very long time until urged by his followers to do so. Porphyry gives a list of all the treatises he wrote before, during, and after the arrival of his chief editor, Porphyry, noting that the 24 treatises produced in the middle period display the highest reach of power and attain the highest perfection. The last 9 treatises were written when his mental strength was already waning. He had a lot of followers, we hear, but I myself, Porphyry of Tyre, was one of his very closest friends, and it was to me he entrusted the task of revising his writings. Such revision was necessary. Plotinus could never bear to go back over his old thinking, and his eyesight made for very poor penmanship. He cared little for style or grammatical accuracy, and was highly idiosyncratic in his use of words. He used to work out his design mentally from the first to the last, and when he came to set down his ideas, he wrote all out in one sitting what had been stored in his mind, as though he were copying from a book. His powers of concentration were admirable. Frequently interrupted, he never lost hold of his plan, but would see to his responsibility and then return to his writings, picking up just where he left off, as if no distraction had occurred. Thus Porphyry writes regarding the character and way of life of Plotinus that he was able to live at once within himself and for others. He never relaxed from his interior attention, unless in sleep, and even his sleep was kept light by an abstemious diet. He lived as he taught and thought, in one unbroken concentration upon his own highest nature. Several women, we hear, were greatly attached to him: Gemina, in whose house he lived, and her daughter, Amphiclea, the wife of Ariston, and each devoted themselves assiduously to philosophy. Plotinus cared for the children of his women disciples, and was excellent at managing their estates, and his house therefore was filled with lads and lasses, in whose education he took a great interest, often hearing the children recite verses of their own composition. Plotinus was gentle, always available to help even those with only a slight acquaintance with him. After 26 years in Rome, he was sought as an arbiter in many minor disputes, and never made an enemy of any citizen. In a particularly interesting interlude, he was apparently impervious to bad magic. Olympius, also a pupil of Ammonius, was possessed of a jealous envy towards Plotinus that manifested itself in continual insolence. He finally grew so bitter that he ventured sorcery, seeking to crush Plotinus by star spells. Finding that his experiments were only recoiling upon himself, he confessed to his associates that Plotinus possessed a mighty soul, so powerful so as to be able to hurl every assault back upon those that sought his ruin. Plotinus had felt the magical operation and declared at that moment that Olympius's own limbs were convulsed and his body shriveling like a money bag pulled tight. Olympius, perceiving that he was endangering himself rather than Plotinus, desisted. In another interlude on the spiritual character of Plotinus, we hear that his daimon was declared blessed by an Egyptian priest. The priest, becoming acquainted with the philosopher, became desirous of displaying his powers to him, and he offered to evoke a visible manifestation of Plotinus's presiding spirit. He consented, and the evocation was made in the temple of Isis, the only place which, according to the Egyptian, was pure in Rome. At the summons, a divinity appeared, not a being of the spirit ranks, and the Egyptian exclaimed, "You are singularly graced. The guiding spirit within you is not of a lower degree, but a god." However, at this very moment, the priest's assistant strangled the augury birds, whether through jealousy or terror. So no more was learned, and later Plotinus wrote the Ennead Our Tutelary Spirit, in part on the basis of this experience and to explain the differences between spirit guides. His general attitude towards higher or spirit beings is not so involved, but still forms the model for later Theurgic Neoplatonism. He once remarked, "It is for those beings to come to me, not for me to go to them." On the character of Plotinus as himself a diviner and a therapist, Porphyry relates the story of the thief. Stolen some jewelry in the house. All the servants being gathered together, Plotinus examined him and declared, "Here is the thief." The man at first denying it, but then confessing while being tortured, and the jewelry recovered. The young Polemon's character and destiny, he will be amorous and short-lived, and so it proved. At one point, Porphyry was gripped by melancholy and contemplating suicide. Plotinus discerned his purpose and came unexpectedly to his house where he had secluded himself, telling him the decision sprang not from reason, but from mere melancholy, advising Porphyry to leave Rome, an intervention which may have saved his life. When Plotinus spoke, his intellect visibly illumined his face, always of winning presence, and he became at times still more engaging. A slight moisture gathered on his forehead. He radiated benignity, that is, benevolence, beneficence, magnanimity. On one occasion, while he was still very new to Plotinus' school, Porphyry attempted to refute the doctrines of Plotinus, at which the master assigned another student, Aemilius, to clear up the difficulties. Eventually, Porphyry was converted, wrote a recantation, and read it before the circle. And on another occasion, on Plato's birthday, Porphyry read to Plotinus a poem on the sacred marriage, a piece abounding in mystic doctrine conveyed in veiled words, and full of enthusiasmos or possession by the god. Porphyry has gone mad, thought some members of the circle, but Plotinus said so that all could hear, "Porphyry, you have shown yourself at once a poet, philosopher, and hierophant." This trinity becoming ever after the model of the Neoplatonic philosopher and theurgist. Of course, Plotinus, Porphyry, and all these Neoplatonists thought in the context of the rise of Christianity, and were tasked on many instances for coming to accounts with it. It was at Porphyry's urgings that Plotinus wrote a text against the Gnostics, and also surviving, likely penned by Porphyry himself, against the Christians. This topic is far too detailed to get into in a general introduction here, but highly recommended is Earl Fontenelle's Schwepp podcast series, containing many episodes relevant to the status of Christianity in the 2nd century CE among the Neoplatonists. Most significantly to us is the degree to which Porphyry, especially in the letters to Marcella, his wife, and Plotinus across his Enneads, resonates to our ears as it did to early Christian church fathers as a doctrine very close to Christianity, but with several important differences. We'll examine these more when we turn to the Chaldean oracles at the end of this lecture. At one point, Plotinus' legacy was embroiled in a plagiarism controversy, the Greeks in Rome and further afield accusing him of appropriating the ideas of Numenius. Aemilius, his student, responded with a treatise, The Difference Between the Doctrines of Plotinus and Numenius, which he dedicated to Porphyry, of treatises with this similar title. Yes, indeed, original teachings, like Plotinus's, which aspire to be nothing but the continuation of tradition, require expositors to underline both the continuities and the ruptures with tradition. Cassius Longinus would be differentiated from the Longinus a century earlier, who wrote a treatise on the sublime, or perihoupsis, was a learned and celebrated man. So Porphyry takes a special pleasure in quoting his overall judgment on the philosophy of Plotinus. I am filled with admiration and delight over the general character of the work, the massive thinking of the man, the philosophical handling of problems. In my judgment, investigators must class Plotinus' work with that holding the very highest rank. Porphyry concludes his life of Plotinus by citing and interpreting at length Apollo's own oracle at Delphi on the life of the man Plotinus. Students of the Delphic oracle of Apollo and the surviving fragments of its pronouncements might be surprised to hear how extremely loquacious the oracle becomes when asked about Plotinus, as pointing to the terse and riddling character of the voice of Apollo through his emissary on earth, the Pythia, where Apollo himself positively celebrates Plotinus. I raise an undying song to the memory of a gentle friend, a hymn of praise woven to the honey-sweet tones of my lyre under the touch of the golden plectrum. The muses too I call to lift the voice with me in strains of many-toned exultation, in passion raising over all the modes of song. Come then, sacred chorus, let us intone with one great sound, the utmost of all song, I, Phoebus, singing in the midst. Celestial, man at first, but now nearing the diviner ranks, the bonds of human necessity are loosed for you, and strong of heart, you beat your eager way out of the roaring tumult of the fleshly life, to the shores of that wave-washed coast, free from the thronging of the guilty, thence to take the grateful path of the sinless soul, where glows the splendor of God, where right is throned in a stainless place, far from the wrong that mocks at law. The oracle sings on and on about the glories of Plotinus, ending with a promise that in the realm beyond he will rejoin Minos and Rhadamanthus, Plato and Pythagoras to form one choir of immortal love, the most blessed spirits whose hearts are ever lifted in joyous festival. And on go the subtle windings of the Delphic dance to tell through the golden lyre of Plotinus the haloed soul. Porphyry focuses on one sentence in the oracle in particular, on the relation of mortal finitude and divine infinitude or union with the one, which he calls the term or goal, a sacred marriage of this world and the beyond, accomplished in the life of Plotinus by no mere latent fitness, but by the ineffable act. 4 times during the period of his studies with Plotinus, the philosopher achieved the term, a union with the one. Porphyry declares at the age of 68 that he has accomplished it but once. Verily, the gods set Plotinus on the true path, pouring down on him a dense shaft of light. His writings, though still overlooked, a sacred crypt, are guided by the divine powers. The rest of Porphyry's life of Plotinus interprets the oracle further and discusses the arrangement of Plotinus's writings. Let's transition now to the philosophy of Plotinus, first looking at Hadot's sum up, and then at a few of the Enneads themselves. Hadot begins his synopsis of the Enneads in his book What is Ancient Philosophy. For students interested in more, you should pick up Plotinus, The Simplicity of Vision, by remarking that all of Plotinus's 54 treatises revolve within a theory which explains the genesis of reality from a primordial unity, the one, or the good, and seeks to both experience and account for the appearance of levels of reality, we could say levels of consciousness, which reach from the undescended self ever lower, becoming more tarnished by multiplicity. The first descent is the intellect, the second the soul, and the third sensible things. The task of the philosopher is through inner ascesis to reascend to the supreme reality by progressively attaining levels of self-consciousness that are ever higher and ever more inward. The journey within is the journey above, attainable only through the indissoluble unity of knowledge and virtue, which Hadot calls the spirit of Platonism, and explains as that philosophical knowledge attainable only through existential progression in the direction of the good, or the one. For Plotinus, although we are the true self, and the true self never really descends, but remains one with the intellect and with the God beyond being, there is at the same time the fall of the soul, the fundamental forgetting of our origin and destination in the one. Accordingly, in the first stage of ascent, rational soul becomes aware that it is not intermingled with the irrational soul, but remains ever separate despite being enmeshed in the life of an ensouled body. The essential thing is not the conclusion that there is a rational soul, but rather that we ourselves live as rational souls. Occasionally in Plotinus's writings he speaks directly to his readers, advising them what to do to become philosophers, to realize their true selves. For example, cut things off and examine yourself. Take away what is superfluous. Do not stop sculpting your own statue. Hadot comments, in order to achieve this goal, we must separate ourselves from that which has added itself to the rational soul, and then see ourselves such as we have become, realizing that it is not identified with the irrational soul. Stage 2, the soul recognizes within itself traces of a transcendent intellect, in the form of principles which allow it to reason. Hadot points out that philosophical discourse can only ascend us to the plane of reason. Beyond this, there is the plane of intellect, that is, becoming the intellect through inner experience. Knowing oneself for Plotinus is to know oneself no longer as a human being, but as someone who has become wholly other, someone who tears himself from illusions and forgetting, and even from ratiocination, away upwards to the best part of the soul. The self then discovers that what is highest in the soul is the intellect and spirit, and that unconsciously it constantly lives from the life of the intellect. In this regard, Plotinus is situated firmly in the Aristotelian tradition. The goal of life is life according to the spirit, life according to the intellect, the thought that thinks itself. This we are always already doing unconsciously for Plotinus. The task is to turn our attention to that transcendence which opens itself in the self. And this is the first stage at the end of stage 2 of the mystical experience. Simultaneously, a becoming other and a being torn upwards. how are we to imagine what it means to become intellect? On this subject, Plotinus' writings are highly experimental, extremely vivid testimonies of his inner experience. That we always already are and must become the divine intellect is a theoretical proposition. What is unique about Plotinus is that he performs this union in the ineffable act of thinking, and so for Hadot can be squarely situated within the model of Aristotelian thought as perfectly adequate and transparent self-knowledge, the nous or divine mind that thinks itself. To become intellect and dwell among the forms is thus to think of ourselves from the viewpoint of totality, not by itemizing this totality, but experiencing its concretion, inwardness, and profound harmony. Quote from Plotinus, we must see the spirit as our own self. Plotinus' philosophy of the divine intellect or post-Aristotelian nous is not, however, the final goal of the Ascent. The stage of realizing its identity with the intellect, the self has not yet reached the end. As Hadot writes, according to Plotinus' image, the intellect in which we are submerged is like a wave which, as it swells, raises us up towards a new vision. Beyond the unitotality represented by the intellect, which is only a derivative unity, we must necessarily admit an absolute and primary unity, the One. Yet here philosophical discourse reaches its limits. For the One is ineffable, and the Logos cannot express what absolute unity is, since to speak of the One is to attach complements or attributes to it by means of subjects and verbs. But the One, since it is absolutely one, can have no complement or attribute. It is the One alone with itself, the solus ipse of the philosophers, most inwardly expressed in the whole history of philosophy, perhaps in Plotinus' mystical vision. Hadot goes on, our only access to this transcendent reality is non-discursive, unitive experience. Experience of the intellect, so close to the One, corresponds to a state of the self in which it achieves inwardness and perfect transparency with itself. Plotinus says nothing at all ontologically about the One, he only describes the subjective state of the person who experiences it. This model of staged levels of reality and consciousness of the self, which correspond to them, remind us of Eastern philosophy, and in some respects of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which speaks of the primary undifferentiated clear light of the good, as well as the secondary clear light of the good, or realm of thought as differentiating unity. There is a descent beneath the differentiated light of the divine intellect, but this experience itself, at the same time, truly leads to the One. Metaphysics or theology, which can only be discursive, provides us with teaching and instruction about the good and the One. But what actually leads to the One is virtue, purification of the soul, and the effort to live the life of the spirit. And so Plotinus' teaching is like an inner signpost, which tells us in which direction we must go. In order to reach the One, however, we must begin to actually walk the road that we travel always alone towards the alone. The benefit of philosophy ends in what is beyond philosophy, union with the One itself. But attaining even to the intellect touched by the One, the individual soul or spirit full of the otherness of divine soul, divine spirit becomes drunk with love, drunk on nectar, and flourishes with enjoyment. The outcome of all ascent, as the soul again descends, can be understood as a festivity of Logos, a love that overflows its boundaries and purifies the worlds below. Through philosophy leading to inner experience, we learn to situate ourselves from the point of origin, where all things emanate from the good, this being none other than the point at which the intellect itself is born. If this all seems like way too much way fast to fully understand, don't worry, we're going to do 2 more passes on it, first through Plotinus' own writings, and second, through the less rigorous, but easier to understand version of Plotinus' thought, replete of course with errors of its own versus the master that we find in the Chaldean oracles. Building up to this, let's just highlight a few core aspects of Plotinus' philosophy. First, the core of the Plotinian inner experience. Reality itself, what is oneness, allness, divinity, experienced, ineffable majesty, and above all, a unity that is transcendent, absolute, good, and the source of all multiplicity. This One overflows itself and its own unity through what Plotinus calls emanation. And he gives us a beautiful metaphorical image to describe the unfolding of the One into the many. Picture a spring that has no further origin. The spring, which is the source of itself, pours itself into all rivers. never becoming exhausted of the gift that it yields. It is the spring, remaining in itself undisturbed. The stream that issues from it, before flowing away in their own directions, mingle together for a time, but each already knows where it will take its flood. Or think of the life that circulates in a great tree. The originating principle of this life remains at rest and does not spread through the tree because it has, as it were, its seat in the roots. The principle gives to the plant all its life and its multiplicity, but remains itself at rest, not a plurality. It is the source of plurality. These are powerful metaphors which explain for Plotinus his doctrine of emanation from the One, the spring that is the source of itself and the life that circulates in a great tree. The One is both these things, not a plurality, but the source of plurality. The tree describes the life of the One throughout multiplicity, but it is the spring that comes closest to describing the One itself. The spring is full and lacking in nothing, and what it emanates is nous, pure intelligence, from which, in turn, like a stream within the spring, is derived the world soul. In answer to the question why there is so much, Plotinus answers, because it is the nature of the One, of the spring, to emanate, to overflow as much as possible, ungrudging and infinite in its giving. The three levels of reality for Plotinus are thus the One, the new or divine intellect, and the world soul. Or continuing with our metaphor, the spring, its motion, and its stream. Ultimately, both the nous or divine intellect and the world soul are consubstantial with the One, to speak in the language of the Christian Nicene Creed. And Plotinus's world is one of continuity and transformation. The multiple is really one, although it may appear otherwise. The world soul is the unity of a multiplicity of actual beings. And the new or divine intellect is what produces the very being of the multiple from the original unity. God or the One or the good is beyond rational understanding and the source of all reality. The main division of Plotinus's philosophical system is thus on the one hand absolute transcendence, the One, and on the other emanationism, the many. The standard picture of emanation in Plotinus looks a little like this. The One overflows itself as the divine mind, which in turn overflows itself as the world soul, in turn overflowing itself as individual souls, who in turn produce the physical cosmos. This is the hierarchical or hieratic description of descent from the One. But these arrows could very well be reversed. The key for Plotinus is to realize that the lowest region of the cosmic order is the full realization of its origin and tends upwards. Unifying the highest and the lowest in the Plotinian system, we can thus ask, what is the nature or physis of the One? And in answer to this question, Plotinus writes, every nature must produce its next, for each thing must unfold seed-like from indivisible principle into visible effect. All is the result of this immense power, giving its gift to the universe, unable to let any part remain without its share. Within Plotinian thought, the nature or physis of the One could just as well be the one of physis or nature. So far as the multiple physis stands under the One, unfolds in the process of individuation, it must produce its successor within the chain of cause and effect. Nevertheless, each thing that exists in nature unfolds like a seed from the indivisible principle of the One into the effects of the multiple. The principle or oneness of the multiplicity remains unaltered throughout the process of nature. Nature becoming on this model, like in Renaissance semiology, a hieroglyph of the inexpressible power residing in the unity. The One is itself this immense power of giving its gift to, and we could say as, the universe, every individual being existing at the limits of possibility and thus receiving its share from the One. Yay! New, warmer, wide-angle camera. So our textbook provides 3 selections from Plotinus's Enneads. As we've learned already, the arrangement of the Enneads was designed by Porphyry, and in order to cohere with the order of initiation into philosophy and topics in the Platonic dialogues. Accordingly, the actual chronology in which Plotinus wrote various of the Enneads has to be reconstructed from our edition of the text. This list of the chronology is also provided by Porphyry, and so it's common to cite the Enneads, in this case 6 groups of 9 treatises by the Ennead, number 1, the treatise within that Ennead, and then a third number reflecting its order in the chronology of Plotinus' writing. I am by no means yet a Plotinus scholar, so the discussion will be quite introductory, discussing various citations from our textbook selection. There really is no correct place to start with the Enneads, since each treatise within each one leads to all the rest. But it's customary to begin the study of Plotinus with his conception of the beautiful, which is for him the first manifestation, expression, or hypostases of the one or the good. We've already covered Plotinus' 3 hypostases, or 3 basic levels of reality. Remember this guy, the one or the good? Its first manifestation in Plotinus' thought is as the beautiful. So he asks, is everything beautiful with one same beauty, or is there a beauty proper to the bodily and another to the bodiless? What is there, one or many beauties? And here Plotinus notes, the same bodies are seen at some times to be beautiful and at other times not. What is it that lures the eyes of onlookers and bends them to itself, and makes them pleased with what they see? Plotinus rejects the idea that it is the whole that is symmetrical and proportioned, or the hues or colors or gold, or a single star by night, or a single musical tone, or even a beautiful ensemble of notes. Nor is it a beautiful face, for all these qualities are not perceived at all times and draw their beauty from something else. All these beauties which draw their beauty from something else are the sensible beauties, and alongside these, in accordance with the schema set out in Plato's Symposium, are the intellectual beauties. These include the beauty of dedicated life, of a thought expressed, and the virtues, the beauty of the soul. For Plotinus, as for Plato, the beauty of the soul and the intellect is more constant and does not depend on outward qualities. On the beauty of the soul, he goes on to note that the soul is not a simple unity, nor does it have quantitative numerical symmetry. Rather, beauty in the soul depends on balancing and interplay of the soul's potencies and purposes. Again, like in Plato, the soul's multiplicity. Remember, the soul in Plato was tripartite, consisting of appetitive, spirited, and rational parts. This multiplicity depends in the soul on unity, above all, the beauty of the solitary intelligence or mind, and its participation in what is alike or akin to it. And this accounts for why the soul cannot fall in love with the ugly, the disagreeable, or the alien without shrinking back and being repulsed. Plotinus asks, what is the connection of loveliness here below and in the intelligible realm, and underlines that both are sharers of the same idea. Indeed, the beauty of bodily forms comes from communion with the intelligible realm. The invisible beauty, or Heraclitus' hidden harmony, is yet more beautiful than all the beauties we perceive with the senses or with the mind. For beauty itself is the first hypostasis, or emanation from the one, the one's manifestation throughout reality. And so, in the realm of sound, unheard harmonies create harmonies we hear because they stir an awareness of beauty by showing it to be a single essence in diversity. And just as it is impossible to talk about bodily beauty if one is born blind and has never seen bodily beauty, so it is impossible to talk about the luster or gleaming of right living and right learning if one has never cared for such things and never beheld the face of justice and temperance and seen that its beauty is beyond the beauty of the evening or morning star. When we see the true beauty of things and the being of the world, we are seeing not with the physical eye, but with the eye of the soul. And those who are attuned to this beauty through the intelligence are the true lovers of beauty. Plotinus asks regarding the beatific vision, what is this intoxication, this exaltation, this longing to break away from the body and live sunken within the self? All true lovers experience it. For in yourself and in others you see largesse of spirit, goodness of life, chasteness, the courage behind a majestic countenance, gravity, and the self-respect which pervades a temperament which is at peace and without passion. And above all these beauties of the soul, you see the radiance of the intelligence diffusing itself throughout them all. In contrast to the true lovers of beauty, who shape their inner experience in accordance with the manifestation of the beautiful, Plotinus opposes the ugly soul. Take then an ugly soul. It is dissolute, unjust, teeming with lusts, torn by inner discord, beset by craven fears and petty envies. It thinks indeed, but it thinks only of the perishable and the base. The life the ugly soul leads is dark with evil and sunk in manifold death, always immersed in matter and sucking matter into itself. In this trafficking with what is unworthy, it has bartered its idea for a nature foreign to itself. The soul that becomes ugly is simply the unpurified soul. The purified soul, in contrast, is wholly idea and reason. It becomes free of the body, intellective, and entirely of that intelligible realm whence comes beauty and all things beautiful. The more intellective the soul is, the more beautiful it becomes. And this is why it is right to say God and the beauty of the soul consist in becoming godlike, because from the divinity all beauty comes and all the constituents of reality. More precisely, the intelligence draws from the good, and beauty expresses the good of the intelligence. The soul, in turn, rendering this beauty into matter. Individual souls should aim to ascend towards the good and be united with it, since it is our one true love, and disdain wherever possible imported or alloyed or less primal beauties here below. Plotinus is always at his best when he attempts to explain the phenomenology of the inner experience, of the beatific vision or unification with the intellect and the one. What is this vision like, he asks? How is it attained? How will one see this immense beauty that dwells, as it were, in inner sanctuaries and comes not forward to be seen by the profane? Let him who can arise, withdraw into himself, forego all that is known by the eyes, turn aside forever from the bodily beauty that was once his joy. Plotinus and the Neoplatonists in general are also well known for their allegorical interpretations of Homer. As we hear in the Odyssey, let us flee then to the beloved fatherland. The theme here of Odysseus' nostos, or return. This is sound counsel, Plotinus notes, but what is this flight? How are we to gain the open sea? For surely Odysseus is a parable for us here when he commends flight from the sorceries of Circe or Calypso, being unwilling to linger on for all the pleasure offered to his eyes and all the delights of the senses which fill his days. The fatherland for us is whence we have come. There is the Father. What is our course? What is to be the manner of our flight? Here is not journeying for the feet. Feet bring us only from land to land. Nor is it for coach or ship to bear us off. We must close our eyes and invoke a new manner of seeing, a wakefulness that is the birthright of us all, though few put it to use. Many passages like this show Plotinus to be one of the world's first inner-worldly travel writers. Remember the motto of Epictetus in the Enchiridion, bear and forbear? One of Plotinus's best mottos in the Enneads is strain and see. What then is this inner vision? Withdraw into yourself and look. If you do not see beauty within you, do as does the sculptor of a statue that is to be beautified. Cut away all that is excessive, straighten all that is crooked, bring light to all that is overcast, labor to make all of one radiance of beauty. Never cease working at the statue until there shines out upon you from it the divine sheen of virtue, until you see perfect goodness firmly established in a stainless shrine. Have you become like this? Do you see yourself abiding within yourself in pure solitude? Do you see yourself in this state? Then you have become vision itself. Be of good heart. Remaining here, you are ascended aloft. You need a guide no longer. Strain and see. Let each one become godlike and beautiful who would contemplate the divine and the beautiful. As ascending, the soul will come first to the intelligence and will survey all the beautiful ideas therein and will avow their beauty. For it is by these ideas that there comes all beauty else. What is beyond the intelligence we affirm to be the nature of the good, radiating beauty before it. And this is why Plotinus calls the beautiful the first hypostases, sediment, essence, or expression of the one, from hupo under and stasis standing. The one, or the good, radiates beauty, where this beauty is prior even than the dividing up of the intelligibles within intelligence. And so Plotinus distinguishes beauty, which is the place of the ideas, from the good that lies beyond the beautiful and is its source and principle. Although the beauty of the one transcends upon even the intelligence, it is in the intelligible realm that beauty dwells and finds its place. If the true nature of the undescended soul or self remains united with the world soul, the intelligence, and even the one itself, then why does the soul ever descend? This is Plotinus's chief intellectual problem. For him, it has happened often, that is the ultimate ascent. But then comes the descent, down from intellection to the discourse of reason, and it leaves me puzzled. Why the descent? Plotinus here searches for the logic of descent and ascent in his philosophical predecessors, and first quotes Heraclitus that contraries necessarily change into each other. Note that this is not so much the materialist Heraclitus focused on becoming, but a Heraclitus of two worlds, a material and a spiritual one, the world of the Logos. The doctrine of the unity of opposites and Heraclitus's account of change are not, however, sufficient for Plotinus. Nor do Empedocles or Pythagoras give adequate answers to this question, why the descent? Only Plato speaks beautifully of the beautiful soul, but even here, according to Plotinus, there are major tensions, if not actual inconsistencies. For example, Plato's metaphors of the body as the tomb or cave of the soul, or Empedocles' metaphor of the body as the grotto of the soul, do not explain why the soul is tied to the body. In Plato's Phaedrus, we merely hear that the loss of one's wings is responsible for the soul's descent. Plotinus wants to know why we are doomed to a life of embodiment if life above is better. There must be something positive which fulfills the nature of the one, the nous, and the world soul in both the fact and process of embodiment. Otherwise, why would it occur at all, and why are we stuck with it? Here Plotinus notes a slightly different Plato than the Orphic one, who more simply denigrates the body as the tomb of the soul, as in the doctrine of Soma Sema. In the Timaeus, and quite out of character, Plato calls the sensible world itself a blessed God, and contends that soul was given to the sensible world by the goodness of the demiurge or the divine intellect, so that the sum of things might be possessed of intelligence. This seems to be the closest Plato ever gets to the doctrine of panpsychism. One of the areas of philosophy in which Plotinus is quite original and a pioneer vis-a-vis Plato and his predecessors is on the relation of soul and body. He argues that the soul is perfect and charged with the managing of bodies less perfect than it. The inner tendency of bodies is separation and dissolution. Their parts return to their natural place, for everything in the cosmos for Plotinus has such a natural place, and bodies are forever exposed to the assaults of alien bodies. It is not that the soul is bodiless for Plotinus, for it too has a body, but a perfect or subtle body, complete and self-sufficient, and it exercises over this body a light control by thought. In any case, both in the intelligible realm and here in the sensible one, it is the soul that gives to body its existence. Plotinus's big question here: how can a body be to the detriment of a soul if the soul itself is what emanates and produces it? Can the soul care for and provide for the body without doing harm to itself? For Plotinus, the answer is yes. Providing for a lower nature does not prevent the agency that exercises it, the soul, from leaving its state of perfection. So we can have perfected souls, so long as they provide for and are concerned with the body in the right kinds of ways. Plotinus notes here two kinds of providence, whereby the soul can act upon and be concerned with the body. One is as a sovereign king, giving orders which the body carries out, and the other is as a direct operator, that is, adapting itself as soul or agent to the patient, the body. The first kind of providence of the soul to the body is to be preferred. The second one is what leads to all the difficulties. For it is not, in the first instance, in the nature of souls to adapt themselves to what is lower, such as bodies. The soul, when it existed in heaven, in the world, soul, and beyond, is sovereign. That is, it transcends to the highest and is immanent on this model of sovereignty and giving commands to the lowest. As an operator of the body, however, adapting itself to the body, the soul loses its sovereignty in this physical cosmos. Plotinus is very concerned that we can't blame a god for this, for the soul itself is still the divine soul, and it's pretty much its own fault that it cultivates attachment to the lower, an individual body, as well as independence from the world soul. This provides the Plotinian account of the origin of evil. The soul's desire for independence from the world soul results in its being cut off from the wisdom of the intelligence, which could more appropriately guide its relation to the body. Desiring independence, the soul becomes attached to its body, confusing itself as soul with this body. However, the divinity of each soul remains, for it is in the very nature of the soul to transcend the body, and is never fully without this transcendence. Nor does the body, in fact, hinder the soul's intellective acts. Nor does it penetrate the soul with pleasure, lust, and fear. In fact, the relation of the world soul with all its individuals to the sensible world is similar to the relation of the souls of stars to their bodies. For Plotinus, this relationship is not interdependent, and the world soul itself, comprising all the multiplicity of individual souls, remains what it is throughout its association with the body, nothing going in, nothing going out, lacking nothing, and ruling. The individual soul is always with the world soul and the things above, and always governing the realm of the senses. More on the relation between the world soul and our individual souls, Plotinus returns to his main question. Why is the human soul subject to ills, suffering, grief, fears, and evils? Why is it chained and entombed in the body, the realm of the senses being called a cave or a grotto? In the Plotinian system, we must recall the divine intelligence is itself both one and many, the thinking and the many objects of thoughts, which are the ideas. The soul as well is both one and many, the world soul and the many individual souls. He describes the intelligence as a superorganism, which contains potentially all the other intelligences. These other intelligences, however, do not exist in actuality except at the level of the world soul. But even here, each individual intelligence has its own actuality within the one intelligence. In answer to the question how things like the intelligence, the world soul, and individual souls or minds can be both one and many, he gives us a helpful metaphor. Think of a city as having a soul. It would include inhabitants, each of whom have a soul. The soul of the city would be more perfect and powerful. What would prevent the souls of the inhabitants from being of the same nature as the soul of the city, in addition to having their own individual souls? This introduces a bit of a paradox, since being individuated means being in some sense one. Yet smaller singularities, such as specific ideas in the mind or individual souls, are greater than themselves in their multiplicity, that is, in their return to the world soul and the thoughts of the intelligence. The function of the soul is not limited to intelligence, lest it would not be soul, but would simply remain in the divine mind. Plotinus here introduces his tripartite doctrine of the operations of the soul, which correspond to his three hypostases. In directing itself to what is above, the soul thinks and becomes the nous. In directing itself to itself, the soul preserves itself and is the world soul. And in directing itself to what is lower than itself, it orders, administers, and governs, that is, the world of nature, in the ordinary sense. On the reason for the descent of individual souls out of the world soul and into embodiment, Plotinus concludes that the main cause for the descent is the will to independence. The soul or world soul itself exists because the totality of things cannot be limited to the intelligible so long as a succession of further existence is possible. In other words, the soul is a necessary product of the overflow or emanation of the one, first as the intelligence, then as the world soul with its individual intelligences. Now for Plotinus, it's a kind of law that all souls want to go home to the intelligence. Furthermore, if individual souls remain within the world soul, they are in touch with the intelligence and beyond harm and share in the world soul's governance. These souls residing in the world soul are like kings who never come down from the palace and are always in one place. Judeo-Christian Islamic theology will come to call these souls angels. However, according to Plotinus, individual souls end up descending from this condition of a unified multiplicity in all of its cosmic dimensions to a condition of individuality. They wish to be independent. And in a very fascinating observation, Plotinus notes the souls are tired, you might say, of living with someone else. That is, of having all the thoughts of individual souls within the world soul constantly in their mind, with little to no distinction between self and other. Such souls descend into a body. However, when they remain for long in this withdrawal and estrangement from the whole, with never a glance back towards the intelligible, they become things fragmented, isolated, and weak. And this is because activity in the enmattered world of individual souls lacks concentration and gets distracted. Here in the sensible world, our soul's attention becomes tied to particulars, and eventually souls become deeply enmeshed in the body. In this way, becoming an enmattered soul is positively a danger to the body. In Plato's metaphors, a loss of wings or a chaining of the soul, indeed a loss of innocence, and a loss of sovereignty from the higher realm. Life above was far better than this, Plotinus asserts from the confidence of his inner experience. For in the world soul, the individual souls were as gods, but here in the sensible world we are as things fallen, chained, at first barred off from the intelligence, and living only by sensation, in a tomb or cavern pent. And here we encounter yet again Plotinian optimism. The higher parts of the soul remain above, despite our enmeshment in the physical world. Let the soul, taking its lead from memory, merely think on essential being, and its shackles are loosened, and it again soars. And so in this Plotinian conception, the soul is ever living a double life insofar as it's embodied, partly in the intelligible world and partly in the sensible. We know why the soul does this, because of the will to independence, but how does it do it? How is the soul becoming enmattered consistent with the goodness of the One and the divine intelligence that reflects on it? Plotinus makes an interesting point here, noting there is no contradiction between the sowing to birth and the willing descent for the perfection of the whole. The soul that wills independence wills to become one, singular, unique, and in this way takes one for the team, as it were, and furthers the actuality of the oneness of the multiple. Above is justice, below is the cave. Above is necessity, and below free choice. However, necessity includes free choice. This whole way of conceiving the process of individuation from the world soul sounds a lot like the Bodhisattva tradition within Mahayana Buddhism. It is the Greek philosophers, however, that are, of course, Plotinus's intellectual context, and he again engages with Empedocles and Heraclitus on the reasons for and consequences of the descent of the soul. Empedocles had described a flight from God and a wandering in punishable sin. For Plotinus, however, the flight from the highest is at the same time the supreme risk of the loss and recovery of the highest. Heraclitus had described a repose of the soul that is in flight, as well as a paradoxical both willing and unwilling descent. This is also insufficient for Plotinus. Anticipating in late antiquity a more modern doctrine of freedom, he rejects the contradictory or paradoxical idea that the soul's descent is at once willing and unwilling. It must be a matter of free choice, and it must serve some function in the whole which leads back to the one. What Nietzsche will eventually call the innocence of becoming, which he locates in Heraclitus, seems pretty far from Plotinus's account of sin that is wrong or moral evil. Plotinus thinks that the soul incurs evil through a two-stage process. First, the descent itself, what Plotinus calls the soul's exuberance towards independence and its own powers. You can here imagine the individual soul floating around in the world soul, tired of mirroring multiplicity and exuberant, and misguidedly so about its ability to strike out on its own, thereby claiming for itself the one. This first incursion of evil or sin into the soul is easily purified. It is the second evil incurred that really gets the soul into the quandaries of attachment. For having descended, the soul is responsible for the evil done upon arrival here below. The first evil is innocent, like the exuberance of a child. Only the second evil is punishable by divine law, and for extreme cases of attachment to evil or perversity, a severe penalty is administered by avenging daimons. According to Plotinus, the soul, itself a lesser divinity, by the stress and strain of its own powers and attraction of governing what is below, plunges into the sphere or sphiros that is nature, physis, or cosmos. If it returns quickly, say after a life or two, it will have suffered no harm, but it will have learned what evil and sin are, that is, it will have lost its innocence, perhaps being less susceptible to the exuberance of the first descent. Why are souls able to learn something new about morality, good and evil on account of their descent here below? Here Plotinus explains that the sphere of nature brings into manifest play what is merely potentiality in the intelligible world. This interestingly suggests that this physical world is something superadded and that there is more actuality in it. And it also seems to reverse Aristotle's dictum that actuality is prior to potentiality, by returning in a way to Plato. In fact, dunamis, power or potential, is more in being and has more reality, just as the idea is more real than its many instances or copies. The soul's descent into the body, provided it returns quickly enough, is a loss of innocence and an acquisition of moral knowledge, because the sphiros of Physis is governed by strict law. This is not to say that lawful relationships do not obtain between ideas in the intelligence or between individual souls and the world soul, but rather that strict law is more actualized, more a constant feature of life in enmattered nature. Building up to a more fundamental statement of his doctrine of the three hypostases, Plotinus now speaks of the layered relationship of the one to individual souls. The one must not be solely the solitary. If the one were solitary, reality would remain buried and shapeless, since in the one there is no differentiation of forms. No beings would exist at all if the one remained shut up in itself. More than that, the multiplicity of beings issued from the one would not exist as they do if there did not issue from the one those beings that are in the rank of souls. And likewise, given this issuance from the one, souls must not play the solitaries. When they do, their issue or mission is stifled. Again, every nature must produce its next, for each thing must unfold seed-like from indivisible principles into visible effects. The process of nature naturing in the soul is thus simultaneously a multiplication and a will to return to original unity. And along all paths of the one in the multiple, nothing hinders anything from sharing in the good to the extent that it is able. Despite the denigration of matter or the physical body as the hungry ghost of higher realms, Plotinus's overall conception of the sphere of nature is optimistic, redemptive, and even quite utopian. And he explicitly asserts here that this statement holds true even for matter. Matter, too, is good, in that it is receptive to the good and has a share in communicating the good to all. While the world soul participates directly in the intelligible realm, the individual soul either participates in the intelligible through the world soul or reproduces it in its own work through imitation or mimesis. And through these doctrines, Plotinus arrives at his notion of the multilocality of the soul being in many places along the stages of the hypostases of reality all at the same time. For, quote, by nature divine, the soul is located in the nethermost limit of the intelligible realm, bordering on the realm of sense, and there gives to the realm of sense something of its own. In turn, it is itself affected when, instead of controlling the body without endangering its own security, it lets itself be carried away by an excessive zeal or exuberance and plunges deep into the body and ceases to be wholly united with the soul. For the intelligence, to reason discursively is to descend to its lower level rather than to rise to the level of the existence beyond. Just as for the intelligence, to reason discursively means to descend to its lower level, which is the world soul, similarly, for the individual soul, its lowest act is to descend to the realm of sense, its highest to reascend to the contemplation of supernal beings. In the case of the soul, if the part that is in the realm of the senses dominates or becomes dominated and disturbed, this will cut us off from what always already the higher parts of our souls contemplate. For individual souls, contemplation or noesis, the nous self-thinking, is fragmentary and divided by time, so our conversation begins from a lower level. However, the world soul from which we descended never becomes involved in the activities of the lower world, and is that part of us insensitive to the lure of passing pleasures and whose living corresponds to its reality. And so Plotinus exhorts us to the ascent, return to the world soul, return to the intelligence, and return to the one. Writing beautifully, how is it that souls forget the divinity that begot them, so that, divine by nature, divine by origin, they now know neither divinity? This evil that has befallen them has its source in self-will, in being born, in becoming different, in desiring to be independent. Having become the fallen soul, the individual soul must rise to the undescended self, to the contemplation of the world soul, the intelligence, and the One. And how great must the intelligence itself be if it is greater than the world soul? Almost sounding like a contemporary writer of the New Age, Plotinus asks, if it is the soul that makes us lovable, why is it that we seek it only in others and not in ourselves? You love others because of the soul in them. Love then yourself. For so divine and precious is the soul, be confident that by its powers you can attain to divinity. The first motto of Plotinus we covered here, strain and see, thus becomes the second, start your ascent. You may recall from studying Plato the frequent indebtedness of Plato's thinking to Greek religion and mythological traditions, including the invention of many new myths of his own. In the Neoplatonists, mythology, religion, poetry, and philosophy are not really so different. And even in his most sublime conception of the three hypostases, that is, the beautiful itself from the One, the divine intelligence, and the world soul, Plotinus reads the inception of this wisdom in the mythological tradition. The nous and its noetic realm, the intelligence, is, for Plotinus, the god Kronos. The noetic world is the true realm of Kronos, whose very name suggests both abundance, koros, and intelligence, nous. In Kronos is contained all that is immortal, intelligent, and divine. There is the very place of the soul. There is eternal rest. So Kronos, the previous ruler of the cosmos between Zeus and his Olympian order, is the noetic, is both intelligence and being. And being, that is being itself, and as an object of thought, gives to the intelligence its thinking and its existence. Intelligence and being, the realm of Kronos, king of the Golden Age in mythology, are together and never apart. However, intellection implies difference as well as identity. Drawing from Plato's Parmenides as well as the Sophist and the Philebus, the primary terms of philosophy are thus intelligence, the nous, being, which is the same as thinking, as in Parmenides, as well as identity and difference. To these traditional four fundamental terms of philosophy or ontology, Plotinus adds movement and rest, always in this order, motion coming first. Motion and rest are, in the first instance, the movement and rest of the intellective activity itself. However, through overflowing difference, it becomes the movement and rest of the world soul and the individual souls who are everlastingly vivified by the intelligence. Again, connecting his thought to traditional mythology, Plotinus writes, the intelligence of which we speak deserves to be of this lineage, that is the mythological one, and to derive from no other sources than the supreme. Once begotten, it begets with it all beings, all the beauty of the idea, all the intelligible deities. Full of the things it has begotten, the intelligence devours them in the sense that it keeps them all and does not allow them to fall into matter or to come under the rule of Rhea. Rhea, whose name means flow, was the Titan queen and wife of Kronos, here associated by Plotinus not with the intelligence, nor even with the world's soul, but with the very fall into matter, and what would seem on the face of it to be a fairly grotesque and primitive vision in Hesiod's Theogony, that is, of Kronos devouring his children, so as to secure and preserve his rule, becomes in Plotinus the most sublime intellective act itself, the redevouring of the world soul by the intelligence. Quote, this the mysteries and myths of the gods obscurely hint at. Kronos, the wisest of the gods, was born before Zeus and devoured his children, quite like the intelligence, big with its conceptions and in a state of satiety. Then, out of his fullness, Kronos begot Zeus. This suggesting that Zeus is the operative supreme deity at the level of the world soul. The myth of succession in Hesiod's Theogony, first Gaia and Uranos, earth and sky, being king and queen, then Kronos and Rhea, then Zeus and Hera, becomes for Plotinus a cipher of his three hypostases. Zeus and Hera presiding over the world soul, Kronos without Rhea over the intelligence, since Rhea has been demoted to the sphere of nature, and the one with its emanation of the beautiful being the new origin myth, replacing the birth of Uranos from Gaia and the wedding of heaven and earth. This is Greek mythology refiltered through the transcendence of Platonic mythemes. Although a few times in the Enneads he notes his originality, Plotinus's goal is the furthest thing from being an original thinker. Rather, he locates the core points of his philosophical system as an interpretation of Plato. According to Plotinus, it was Plato who first established the doctrine of the three hypostases, or 3 degrees of reality. The father of the first cause of the universe is the good, or the one beyond being, as in the Republic. The cause itself is the demiurge, or the intelligence, responsible for the being of beings in the world, as in the Timaeus. And the world soul, or higher dimension of Physis, is prior to physical nature and productive of it. These 3 degrees of reality may have been taught in a similar way in Parmenides' 3 ways. However, as Plotinus notes, Parmenides called being the one and didn't sufficiently distinguish it from the multiple. Plotinus thus notes his greatest debt to Plato, who in the Parmenides more accurately speaks of the first one, the second one, which is multiple, the intelligence, and the third one, the world soul, which is one in manifoldness. And other ancient philosophers to whom Plotinus acknowledges a significant debt include not only Anaxagoras, but also Aristotle, Pythagoras, and Pherecydes. For Anaxagoras as well spoke of a pure unmingled intelligence and of how the one is both primary and separate. Even Heraclitus taught that all beings are in the process of flux and return to the one. Plotinus takes issue with Aristotle when he says that the first existent is separate and intelligible. For in saying that the one as nous thinks itself, Aristotle denies it transcendency. Plotinus will thus rigorously distinguish the one or the good beyond being from the intelligence itself. And according to him, Aristotle's doctrine of the intelligible agencies was different than Plato's, but there was no valid, truly philosophically motivated reason for this change. And for support here, Plotinus looks back to the doctrines of Pythagoras and Pherecydes, who both maintained the existence of the intelligible realm, and who Plotinus implies would not have collapsed that realm ontologically into the one itself. Quote, that beyond being there exists the one, we, Plotinus, have attempted to prove as far as such an assertion admits of proof. In the second place come being and the intelligence in the third soul. And this concludes our very cursory preliminary review of Plotinus's text, the Enneads, and of his 3 primal hypostases. Just a few final points to note before we move on to the later Neoplatonists. When we study ancient creation myths, we like to have a nice temporal structure with which to understand them. First came this, then that, and so on in a sequence of divine events before and after. However, in the 3 Plotinian hypostases we have discussed, there is as yet no time, no temporal order of becoming, no before and after. The Plotinian creation myth is synchronic and simultaneous, and everything that occurs at all 3 higher levels of reality takes place against the backdrop of eternity and the eternal moment. There's significant debate in the Plotinian scholarship as to how exactly temporalizing and the order of time, and thus the time-space of nature and natural processes, gets going. Perhaps it is the individual souls who descend from the world soul who initiate the temporalizing process in some sense. In any case, time as we understand it occurs for Plotinus only in the sensible world of nature. A second point is that Plotinus, well ahead of his time, seems to be one of the first discoverers of the theory of the unconscious. As in Freud's dictum for psychoanalysis to make the unconscious conscious, Plotinus's project appears to be much the same. Except for him, the unconscious that we must bring to the contents of consciousness is more Jungian or archetypal, the very spiritual reality of the self, existing in eternity at each of the 3 levels of reality. Interestingly, in his text on our tutelary daimon, he posits that the higher unity of each soul, at whatever level of reality it is, can be considered as its daimon, that is, the potentiality of the soul's returning to its higher unity at the next stage. Like in later Neoplatonism, in Plotinus as well, each level of reality is populated with the higher soul unities or daimons, which can remind us and give us daimon mojo to attain the next stage of reality. The age-old distinction between beneficent and baleful daimons also continues in Plotinus, insofar as excessive attachment to the sensible world and the willing of discord and division that occurs here produces the inverted world of the avenging daimons. They are the haunting ghosts beneath even the goodness of matter itself. yet purifying the soul into a position from which it might re-begin its ascent. Next, although the soul is essentially rational for Plotinus, it is not exclusively rational, and nor is the divine intellect merely the realm of discursive reason or logic. Discourse, and nowadays calculative reason, or technics, would be for Plotinus mimetic of the intuitive intellect, but why merely imitate something when we can participate in it intuitively, and as one with it? Indeed, according to Plotinus, the excessive emphasis on discursive reason is itself one of the products of the soul's descent. And lastly, Plotinus, as the inaugurator of what is called late Platonism, is considered by yet later Platonists to have distilled the essential speculative format of Platonic philosophy. However, as we'll see now, later Neoplatonists will often attempt to move the Plotinian system further in the direction of religious syncretism and ritual, such as Theurgy, and will also question the status of nature, or Physis, in Plotinus' thought. Last up on the agenda this week, we're going to look at Post-Plotinian Neoplatonism, specifically the link between Neoplatonism and the magical practice known as Theurgy. This should be the funnest part, and will help us to review Plotinus' vision of the cosmos from the perspective of religion and the mysteries of late antiquity. According to Hadot, Neoplatonism after Plotinus, and as represented by Iamblichus, Syrianus, Proclus, and Damascus, might at first be seen as a development of Plotinus' hieratic system. In fact, however, it is characterized by a gigantic attempt at synthesizing the most disparate elements of the philosophical and religious traditions of antiquity. There was an attempt to create agreement with the philosophical tradition on the one hand, and on the other with the Orphic writings and the Chaldean oracles, considered as traditions of revealed religious revelation from the gods. The task became to systematize all the revealed doctrines, Orphism, Hermeticism, and Chaldeanism, with the philosophical tradition itself, whether Pythagorean or Platonic. And so late Neoplatonism can be understood as a fusion of Platonism, Aristotelianism, and Pythagoreanism with Orphism, Hermeticism, and Chaldeanism. First, you must master all of Plato's and Aristotle's work and the commentaries, then you are ready to channel the gods. For Hadot, this is an incredible juggling act. For the Neoplatonists were able to find the various classes of gods of the Chaldean oracles in each of the articulations of the dialectical argument concerning the hypostases from the one. Hierarchies of notions taken artificially from Plato's dialogues came to correspond term for term with Orphic and Chaldean hierarchies of being. After Plotinus, Porphyry, and Iamblichus, a century later, the most significant and influential Neoplatonist will be Proclus, whose system exerted a fundamental influence on the whole history of Western thought, especially during the Renaissance. By the time of Proclus, the fusion of the Plotinian system with Orphism, Chaldeanism, and other mystery religions produced a richly populated spiritual universe, which the Neoplatonic philosopher could contact directly through the art known as Theurgy. More on that in a minute. Here you see Proclus's richer development of the emanation from the one through various stages before the nous, as well as various deities associated in different aspects with each hypostasis. It is, as in Hesiod's theogony, the muses themselves, or daughters of Zeus and memory, who mediate access to primordial language and originary memory of the supersensible world for mortals. The word theurgios, theurgy, means literally God working or God craft. It does not appear until the 2nd century, and it may have been created by the author or authors of the Chaldean oracles, although in our surviving fragments cognate words appear only once, so this has been debated. What is certain is that all the Neoplatonists look to the Chaldean oracles as the basic text and manual of what they call theurgy, so it's probably still fair to associate the word theurgy with the Chaldean oracles themselves. Prescribed in the oracles are rituals capable of purifying the soul and its immediate vehicle, the astral body, and thus allowing it to contemplate the gods. Rituals included ablutions, sacrifices, invocations using ritual words, which were often incomprehensible, or nomina barbara, that is, words without specific lexical meaning. What differentiated practices of theurgy from ordinary magic is that the theurgist did not claim to force the gods, but aimed at submitting to their will by carrying out the rites they themselves supposedly ordained. Iamblichus, as well as Proclus, go so far as to say that the only thing which can bring about union with the gods is not theoretical philosophy, but rites which we do not fully understand. It is not by intellectual activity that we carry them out. If that were the case, their efficacy would depend wholly on us, not on the gods. It is the gods who take the initiative. They have chosen the material signs or sacraments which attract them and enable us to see divine forms. Hadot notes that this invasion of Neoplatonism by Theurgy is still mysterious to us. It's hard to understand why Neoplatonism, at the end of antiquity, introduced theurgical practice into philosophical practice. Were they competing as a soteriological or salvation-based religion with the rise of Christianity? Or were they merely drawing the ultimate consequence of what Plotinus posited as the separation or fall of the soul from the supersensible world? Probably a bit of both, and it does seem that later Neoplatonists reconceived matter and the sensible world in the Plotinian system, arguing that we needed to go through material and sensible rites in order to be able to rise again towards the divine. And this was a similar move made by Christianity, in which man, once corrupted by original sin, needs the mediation of the incarnate Logos and the sensible signs of the sacrament in order to enter again into contact with God. For both later Neoplatonists and Christianity, man cannot save himself merely by his own strength, but must wait for the divine to take the initiative. The full interpretation of any of Proclus's hymns would be the matter for its own lecture, but just for our enjoyment, you can listen to more readings of the hymns at the end of this lecture. The influence of Orphism on the later Neoplatonists is just as significant as that of the Chaldean oracles. I recommend the book Orphism and Christianity in Late Antiquity for more on the Orphic influence. And you can find several slides in the lecture notes this week, which explain the basics of Orphism to give you an idea, such as these main tenets of Orphic belief, which seem to have been adopted more or less wholesale with some modifications by most later Neoplatonists, especially the purification of the soul and the goal of apotheosis, or immortalization of the soul through union with the divine spirit, accomplished in Orphism as in Theurgic Neoplatonism through telestic henosis, that is, ritualistic unifying of divinity and humanity through special rites. It may be in part due to the Orphic influence that later Neoplatonism cultivated over and against Plotinus a more holistic and integrative attitude towards physis or nature. You can see something of the earlier Greek and Orphic emphasis on the earth, Gaia, the Chthonic, and Physis in the beautiful 2nd century CE Orphic hymn to Physis, also included in the lecture notes and read for you at the end of this video. On the centrality of Physis in the overall Greek conception of nature, from Ionian natural philosophy through Plato and Aristotle, and the other schools of Hellenistic antiquity, you can pick up Pierre Hadot's The Veil of Isis, an essay on the history of the idea of nature. Let's turn now to what is sometimes by scholars called, with a fair degree of irony, the Bible of the Neoplatonists, the Chaldean oracles. As the wiki writes, the Chaldean oracles are a set of spiritual and philosophical texts widely used by Neoplatonist philosophers from the 3rd to the 6th century CE. While the original texts have been lost, they have survived in the form of fragments consisting mainly of quotes and commentary by Neoplatonic writers. They were likely to have originally formed a single mystery poem, although this is debated, which was received in a trance by Julian the Chaldean or his son, Julian the Theurgist, more on them in a minute, sometime in the 2nd century CE. Later Neoplatonists such as Iamblichus and Proclus rated them extremely highly. In fact, some traditions claim the oracles were dictated to Julian the Theurgist by the soul of Plato himself. Psellus, for example, tells us that Proclus tells us that Julian of Chaldea converged the soul of his son, Julian the Theurgist, with the soul of Plato. If this is true, then the surviving fragments of the Chaldean oracles we have are literally Plato himself channeled from the supersensible world. Plotinus never mentions the oracles, at least not clearly. The oracles also provide us with crucial information relevant for other, more magical or theurgic ways of understanding Plotinus's 3 hypostases in their relationship to the sensible world, the sphere of nature, or Physis. One of the key features of the surviving fragments is the worship of the goddess Hekate, a witch goddess or dark goddess of nature who shows up more brightly in Hesiod's Theogony, as well as in her role as escort to Persephone in the Homeric hymn to Demeter. If you get interested in the fascinating relationship between later Neoplatonism and the goddess Hekate, I would recommend first of all Sarah Ilse Johnson's book Hekate Sotyra, and more on the general history and mythology of the goddess Hekate, Sarita Deste's Circle for Hekate. The Chaldeans, and thus the Neoplatonists, certainly worshipped Hekate as the goddess of nature in a sense, and they considered her a 3rd most important deity after the primary and secondary paternal intellects. More on those in a moment. The best edition to get of the Chaldean oracles in translation is the Ruth Majersic edition, and I've included the first roughly 1/3 of the fragments in the course pack this week. Reading them over, we might rightly get quite confused as to whether what is related in the oracles is a philosophical metaphysics or a religious mythology. Indeed, the Chaldean oracles seem to be a blending of both. And there are not only many roles and many Hekates discussed in the Chaldean oracles, but also many divine intellects. You might be tempted to consider the Chaldean oracles merely as magic, mysticism, or sorcery, as Augustine of Hippo eventually did. But for the Neoplatonists, the Chaldean oracles were better characterized as Theurgy, that is, a good kind of magic, which is in accord not so much with discursive reason as with the divine intellect itself. For our purposes, we'll speak of Neoplatonic Theurgy as a call of the gods into this lower physical world to aid the ascent of the soul to what the oracles call the ethereal and empyrean worlds, i.e. what Plotinus had called the world soul and divine nous. When we read the oracles, we see that some of the fragments are more speculative and metaphysical, and others are more mythological and liturgical, or even ritualistic. The highest principle in the Chaldean system is again the Father, who, as in Stoic cosmology, is made of pure fire, and is beyond the physical universe. Interestingly, this Father also has wombs, and so might be androgynous. At the same time, the Father is called the Abyss, or Abyssal Father, and is considered as ineffable or a secret Father. It seems comparable to the pre-Socratic, Stoic, and Neoplatonic one, but with many little twists and turns. As in the Plotinian system, the second principle is the Father as the primary paternal intellect. And interestingly, one of the first emanations in the first Father, or the Abyssal Father, is the goddess Hekate herself, who speaks frequently with her own voice in the oracles. Here you see fragment 1 of the oracles, more concerned with laying out the speculative theology. For there exists a certain intelligible which you must perceive by the flower of the mind. For if you should incline your mind towards it and perceive it as perceiving a specific thing, you would not perceive it. For it is the power of strength, visible all around, flashing with intellectual divisions. Therefore you must not perceive that intelligible violently, but with the flame of mind completely extended, which measures all things except that intelligible. You must not perceive it intently, but keep the pure eye of your soul turned away. You should extend an empty mind towards the intelligible in order to comprehend it, since it exists outside of your mind. Clearly, a lot is going on here, especially a sort of meditative practice, which sounds a bit like the opening of the Tao Te Ching. The Tao that can be perceived is not the eternal Tao. The intellect perceived in a specific thing is not perceiving the intellect. What is recommended is to perceive the intellect not with the discursive mind, but with the flower of the mind, or the flame of mind, what other oracles will call Aeon, or the living power of time, which egresses from the world soul into the physical world of nature, flashing all intellectual divisions. To turn the mind towards the intelligible requires also here an empty mind, not only the mind that perceives pure suchness or thisness, but the mind that intuitively opens itself to the intelligible as something which exists outside of the finite mind or the individual soul. More poetically evoking something like Plotinus's 3 hypostases, the second oracle reads, arrayed from head to toe with a clamorous light, armed in mind and soul with a triple-barbed strength, you must cast into your imagination the entire token of the triad, and not go towards the Empyrean channels in a scattered way, but with concentration. The Empyrean channels means the world of the divine intellect, or nous, intelligible knowledge. Although what the entire token of the triad means here, and whether it refers to something like the 3 hypostases, is quite complicated and requires a brief overview of the Chaldean speculative system vis-a-vis the Plotinian one. Again, first in the Chaldean system is the Father, who perceives the good itself, where the paternal monad exists. And this is described as the one fire, the once transcendent, and also as the ineffable, the hidden, or the abyssal Father. The first emanation, although the oracles don't exactly use that terminology, from the abyssal fiery Father, the One, is the noetic monad, which is itself triadic. Its 3 parts are dunamis, power, patrikos nous, or the paternal nous, and boule, will. Described as the womb of all, It generates the ideas or the pure intelligible forms, and is described as loving, is what the oracles call the secondary paternal intellect, what Plato called the demiurge, which knows the intelligible world order of the noetic monad, but is not the same as this primary intellect. The noetic monad, again, has power, thinking, and will, and is the site for the generation of the intelligible forms. The secondary paternal intellect is, however, a craftsman of fiery cosmos, and creates the empyrean world. The oracles indicate it is also triadic, but the surviving fragments don't give us a clear breakdown of the triadic parts versus the noetic monad. According to the oracles, the secondary paternal intellect or demiurge is often confused by humans with the noetic monad, or even with the one abyssal father, and this because the demiurge is the source of sources and gives access to the flower of fire, the girdling flower, or the powerful breath. The level of the world soul, the oracles averse, is self-generated, but assisted by both the demiurge and perhaps by Hekate. The world soul is described as the worker, dispenser of life-giving fire, filling up the life-giving womb of Hekate, and pouring on the connectors, that is, the mediating powers between the supersensible and the sensible world, a force of fruitful and very powerful fire. And the world soul is also described as triadic, and we get the three elements of the triad here, which are intellect, will, and love. Note the difference here between the Chaldean world soul and Plato's individual soul. In place of the appetites which lead downwards, the world soul has no appetites, but is defined by love. One of the questions we can pose to the oracles is whether dunamis, power, or the first emanation from the Father, is already Hekate, who oversees the world of nature, Physis, or fate, at least in potentiality. Several of the surviving fragments explore this cosmic world structure in some detail, such as fragment 37. The oracles, like Neoplatonic philosophers, at times sound distinctly Christian, at least to our ears. For example, proposing that the most necessary virtues, which purify the soul and lead it back to God, are faith, truth, and love, which sounds very similar to St. Paul's three theological virtues: faith, hope, and love. Greek civilization, since Hesiod didn't think very much of hope, often considering it an evil. However, another oracle reads, "May fire-bearing hope nourish you." Christianity was obviously in the Greek pagan air from the 1st to the 4th century CE. And Porphyry as well elsewhere speaks of the three primary virtues as faith, truth, and love, as in the oracles. Beyond the abyssal or ineffable Father or One in the Chaldean system, the three primary hypostases are the noetic monad, the paternal intellect, and the world soul. And at the very edge of the world soul, we find the god Aeon, or vital time, who alone copiously plucks the flower of the mind from the strength of the Father, and has the power to perceive the paternal intellect, to impart to all sources and principles, and to whirl them about and keep them forever in ceaseless motion. In the context of the oracles, Aeon, a very obscure god here, is often thought to be identical with the noetic sun. It's the true sun beyond the visible one. And much Hellenistic philosophy, especially in the Stoic tradition, going back to Chrysippus, discusses the difference between Aeon and Chronos, vital time versus the succession of time, or even eternity versus time, or deep time versus the passage of time. Exactly where to locate the god Aeon, within or beyond the three triads, is not exceptionally clear in the oracles, but he seems to me as the flower of fire, or the flower of the mind god, to be a mediator between the supersensible and the sensible world, responsible for both the intellectual motion above and the correspondence of the supersensible with the sensible below. At this mediating point in the Chaldean system, we also find the Titan god Atlas, who separates the world of the first fire, the world above, from the world of the second fire, since these are eager to mingle. Atlas is here described as a girdling intellectual membrane. Again, the meaning and function of the goddess Hekate in the Chaldean system is deeply fascinating. Fragment 50 reads, "The center of Hekate is born in the midst of the fathers." This might be suggestive of a place for Hekate at the primary level of reality of the noetic monad, perhaps associated with dunamis, or power. One of the religious practices in the Chaldean oracles is the animation of statues, and fragment 51 and 52 about the goddess Hekate may be a reference what the practitioner might expect to see in the animated Hekate statue. Around the hollow of her right flank, a great stream of primordially generated soul gushes forth in abundance, totally ensouling light, fire, ether worlds. In the left flank of Hekate exists the source of virtue, which remains entirely within and does not give up its virginity. The postulant to Chaldean mysteries is asked to envision Hekate as a double-natured being, from one side ensouling all things that exist in the noetic and the visible cosmos, and from the other side remaining in the noetic world, close to the Father, the highest source of virtue, and never mixed up with the vagaries of contradiction or those of matter. Even more direct on the relation of Hekate and nature or Physis, we hear from Proclus, "The source of nature is in the generative goddess, that is Hekate." Quoting from the oracles, "On the back of the goddess, boundless nature is suspended." And perhaps describing Hekate or nature, or even Rhea, for her hair appears dazzlingly in shimmering light. Recall how Rhea, the partner of Kronos, queen of the Titans, rejected by Plotinus from Kronos' noetic realm. This same Rhea, or at times Rhea Cybele, appears in the oracles, now again exalted as a generative source of all divine life, including intellectual, spiritual, and mundane life. Proclus cites from the oracles, "Truly Rhea is the source and stream of blessed intellectual realities, for she, first in power, receives the birth of these in her inexpressible womb, and pours forth this birth on the all as it runs its course." Not quite as consistent as the Plotinian vision of Greek mythology, the oracles are valuable in being less misogynistically patriarchal. Although Physis or nature is still demoted as fate dangling from the back of the goddess and many goddesses in the noetic sphere still occupy pride of place in the oracles. Fragment 70 further explains the relationship of these goddesses to the physical world of nature. The chief goddess here, even above Rhea, being Hekate. Notice how nature or Physis, suspended from Hekate, is not denigrated, placed outside the supersensible world. Rather, untiring nature rules both worlds and works in order that the sky might turn around, pulling down its eternal course, and that the swift sun might come around the center, just as it is accustomed to do. Exactly how far the rule of nature goes, and whether it is limited to terrestrial and celestial bodies, is unclear. We are still worlds away here from Heraclitus and the Physis that loves to conceal itself, nevertheless is prior to all the gods and the worlds and productive of their divinity and worldhood. Trying to work out the Chaldean system in all the details gets very complicated and abstruse. Louis' The Chaldean Oracles and Theurgy, a book you can't purchase on Amazon for less than $600 these days, ran to over 750 pages in order to harmonize all aspects of our evidence. Probably involved a good deal of Überbedeutung or overinterpretation. In any case, as the wiki states, beneath the world of the intelligible triad of the Father, the Great Mother, Magna Mater or Hekate, and the intellect, lies the three successive descending Empyrean, ethereal, and elemental worlds, corresponding respectively to the Demiurge, the world soul, and physical nature. Bizarrely, beyond the second paternal intellect, there is even a third one, perhaps Aeon, discussed above, who represents the divine power in the ethereal world, and yet a fourth quasi-demiurgic figure, Hypazokos, or the flower of fire, who rules over the elemental world. The wiki seems all too eager to derive Hekate from the world's soul, lower stage in the cosmic process, merely responsible for the emanation of nature. But as we've seen, there are several oracles which suggest a yet more exalted place, where Hekate is one of the very first emanations from the paternal abyss. Not just in the Chaldean system, but throughout the mystery religions of late antiquity, we find the trope that everything beneath the sublunar realm is governed by fate, itself a derivative of nature, where salvation is achieved by ascent through the planetary spheres, during which the soul casts off the various aspects of its lower soul and becomes pure intellect. And so the last level of the Chaldean cosmos, not unlike in the Plotinian system, is the material realm of Physis, below the moon and full of daimones. If this is all sounding a little crazy to you, don't worry, it is a little crazy. What makes it all so philosophically interesting is that all the most accomplished and sophisticated Neoplatonists after Plotinus believed this stuff, even considering it at times a direct channel from the soul of Plato. The later Neoplatonists, through the Chaldean oracles and other theurgy-based practices and speculative liturgies, claim to have fleshed out our picture of the supersensible world through both philosophical argument and religious initiations. What they discovered is that across the three hypostases, and in the physical world of nature governed by fate, there was ever a graduated hierarchy of zones. In the third from highest realm, there are the zones of the Empyrean world produced by the Demiurge, which are then restaged in the ethereal or spiritual world of the world's soul and in the elemental world of nature. Time itself, or the Ion, is the linking of the Empyrean world with the ethereal and the elemental. And fascinatingly, throughout all the zones and linking of the worlds, it is the great goddess Hekate who possesses the keys. Only the Empyrean world and the ethereal world are fully zoned and unaging beyond time, but the soul implicated in subtle matter, becoming the gross matter here below, is, in the language of the oracles, vehicled, which is to say set in motion or carried in motion by something else, a term that indeed goes back to Plato's Phaedrus and the metaphor of the wings of the soul and the choruses of the gods. I've often found the most fascinating thing in the Chaldean oracles to be its depiction of the goddess Hekate. I hope to return to this theme in more detail in a future lecture. For now, at least, very interesting for our purposes are Oracles 101 to 103. Recall how Atlas separated the fires above and below, the first fire from the other fire. In a later oracle, Hekate too is assigned this role, suggesting perhaps a relationship with Atlas, a fellow Titan. Nature, in a way, is a Symbola, or symbolic image of Hekate throughout the oracles, as we hear in Fragment 101, do not invoke the self-revealed image of nature. An injunction which may, on the one hand, subvert Ionian natural thought's appreciation of nature as a self-hiding process, as also in the temple inscription Iynges to the goddess Isis, which suggests the initiant should not aim to or believe he can see the goddess naked, and so a sign of respect for nature. But on the other hand, this fragment might also reveal a more negative attitude towards nature. She is of a lower realm, and her mystery should remain concealed. Related to this same nexus of issues regarding the attitude to nature in the oracles, 102 reads, "Do not gaze at nature. Her name is destiny, or fate, Hymarmene." This fragment seems more clearly to suggest a flight from nature and determining fate. Hymarmene also meaning the influence of the stars and the chain of necessity, or of cause and effect, which is ineluctable in the physical world here below. We should not, according to the oracles, aid in increasing Hymarmene, but rather seek to transcend it back into the ethereal and Empyrean worlds. And here, according to the oracles, the wisest Greeks know that nature is destiny, that is, the necessity of events happening in the way they do. There are clearly ambiguities in the oracle in regards to the depiction of the feminine and nature, and this is part of what makes them such a fascinating text in the Neoplatonic and early Christian context. According to the oracles, human nature is essentially Hecatean, not just Hekate from the heights, but also associated with the dark and demonic. Totem animal of Hekate being the dog, human beings are like ill-tempered dogs who enchant souls, and we must flee the mass of men who are going about in herds, for they do not differ in great measure from dogs without reason. On the other hand, privileged disciples of the goddess Hekate in many magical traditions, including the oracles, celebrate particular human beings, adequate hounds to the goddess and part of her special retinue. And Socrates and the earlier Greek philosophers, such as the Cynics, often describe themselves as hounds to the god in this way without explicitly mentioning the goddess Hekate. Socrates at one point defining the philosopher as a dog who hunts along the traces of the gods and the holy through the art of philosophical thinking. In any case, the overall account of nature or the world of matter in the oracles is not exceptionally positive, as we hear in Proclus, in a commentary on Plato's Timaeus, the entire generative nature in which there exists the turbulence of matter, and also in which there exists the light-hating world, as well as the river of forgetfulness, which signifies for Proclus the flowing of all material things, as stated in the oracles, our onrushing vessel. And in the oracles as well, according to Olympiodorus, we find the image of the human soul as a chameleon, a multiformed image, like in Plato's Republic. Here you see William Blake's famous painting Hekate, showing again her triadic or triple-formed nature, like the human soul. Interestingly, also like three triads in the intelligible realm. Hekate in this sense is, in the world below, a psychopomp, unwilling to abandon the mirroring of the above and the below, discording the human soul, such as even Persephone, through all the darkness and tribulation of matter. In the oracles, as in all of Neoplatonism, the main topos is that of the ascent, the anagoge. As we hear in fragment 190, leading upwards, a certain knowledge of the way of things is engendered within us by superior beings and is adequately revealed in the autoptic manifestations. This word autoptic meaning self-seeing and being very related to epopteia, to have seen the sights in the mystery initiations, as well as to the guidance of the gods, who are not indifferent or withdrawn from human affairs, as they are, say, in the theology of Epicurus. Other the stages of initiations under the guidance of the gods in the ascent upwards disclose the order of the universe to souls and guide our journey to the intelligible and kindle the fires which lead upwards. And again, suggesting the centrality of a more positive image of the feminine and the goddess Hekate and other goddesses, the oracles describe the ascent through the realms of nature and spirit as constantly encountering a goddess who has faces on all sides. And she is visible on all sides and has faces on all sides, receiving in her womb, like Rhea in the fragment earlier, the procession from the intelligibles, and she sends forth the channels of corporeal life and contains within herself the center of the procession of all beings. And in a stunning statement, which again shows the Chaldean oracles and Neoplatonic philosophy as a kind of precursor of our modern depth psychology, and in some sense going back to Heraclitus, for whom no one has plumbed the depth of the psyche so far as her nature extended, we hear, according to the oracle, that what is real is in the depth. Is this the depth below, the lowest level of the Chthonic, or the depth above, the Abyssal Father? Perhaps both in the one whole system of the cosmos. Fragment 184, however, suggests that the ethereal world itself is deep or possesses a certain depth. Here, this is discussed in relation to the solar world, which might mean the physical sun above, but more likely means the noetic sun, of course deeper than the physical world we see. Great spirits helpful for the practice of theurgy in the Chaldean oracles include the Iynges, the connectors, and the Teletarchs. The Iynges are the couriers or messengers of the nous, that is, intellectual supports of the nous in this physical world, and they're depicted as wry-neck birds, and also as operating through or arriving on account of the calling or klesis of magic wheels, which is the strophalos or wheels of Hekate, which Proclus is known to have used in magical rites. The Iynges are important because they mediate access to the nous in the world here below through the theurgic ritual, seem to involve a stretching out of time, space, and phenomena, as the Symbola of the ritual are suffused with intellectual potencies from the world above. The second level of quasi-angelic initiator spirits in the oracles are called the connectors or the sunokes, and these seem to be unifiers or harmonizers of the world above and the world below, matter and spirit. For example, the rays of the physical sun count as connectors or sunokes to the realm of the invisible or noetic sun, discoverable through the mediation of the actual sun's rays. And lastly, the highest order of helpful initiators in the Chaldean system are the Teletarchs. Described as wings of fire and rulers of soul, they are masters of the ceremonial initiation or telestics. In this case, we get the name of the three greatest Teletarchs, which are faith, truth, and love, i.e. the core virtues. And we also hear that there is one Teletarch for each world, a Teletarch of the fiery world, above the demiurgic intellect, of the etheric world, of the world soul, and of the world of matter, thus suggesting that faith, truth, and love map onto the one, the noetic monad or demiurge, plus the world soul, and of course the most important thing in this here world of matter, love. Throughout the Chaldean system, every world at every stage of the cosmic hierarchy possesses its own types of unbending intellectual support. Quite to the contrary of our modern picture of the world, the cosmos is not abandoned in being emanated forth. These three types of initiatory helpers don't map very well onto later Christian, Islamic, or Judaic angelology, but they don't not map onto it either. The Renaissance thinker Pico della Mirandola tried to develop a comparative angelology here. Another fascinating idea found in the oracles, very significant for the subsequent history of Western esotericism, is that the paternal intellect or noetic monad, likely through the demiurgic intellect, has sown symbols throughout the cosmos. That is, even in this physical world of nature, there are certain types of objects which reflect noetic realities more purely than others, and these are called Symbola. The intellect is what thinks these intelligibles in their manifestation, and these intelligibles are themselves called inexpressible beauties. However, we'll be blind to the Symbola sown throughout the world we see unless we learn to remember ourselves through the Ascent, for the paternal intellect does not receive the will of the soul until the soul emerges from forgetfulness and speaks a magic word, remembering the pure paternal token. Token here translating the Greek synthematos, which in some contexts can mean a password or certain words of power, vocus magicae, and a word we also encountered at the beginning of the oracles in fragment 2. We were asked to cast our imagination in with the entire token, or synthematos, of the triad, and so that we can begin the ascent towards the Empyrean channels, not in a scattered way, but with concentration. Perhaps suggesting that the entire model of the three hypostases, each of them triadic in the Chaldean system, are realms of intelligible knowledge we can actually learn to explore through inner experience and the correct performance of the ritual. In Oracle 124, we hear of what almost sounds like Chaldean breathwork or yoga. From Selos, those who, by inhaling, drive out the soul are free. Chaldean rituals seem to invariably involve working with the elements, especially fire, light, water, and breath. Theurgic rituals begin with purifications and sprinklings of water we hear in Proclus, or in the oracles themselves. Above all, let the priest himself, who governs the works of fire, be sprinkled with the icy billows of the deep roaring sea. Some kind of scrying or divination seems to be implied by fragment 145. Therefore the gods admonish us to perceive the shape of light which has been stretched forth. This is in Greek the noein morphe photos, which is stretched out into visible appearance or phenomena from the Empyrean realm. Such visions of fire can be less definite in the oracles, but also very specific, as in fragment 146. After this invocation, it says, "You will either see a fire, similar to a child, extended by bounds over the billows of the air, or you will see a formless fire, from which a voice is sent forth, or you will see a sumptuous light, rushing like a spiral around the field, but you may even see a horse, more dazzling than light, and even a child mounted on the nimble back of a horse, a child of fire, or covered with gold, or again a naked child, or even a child shooting a bow and standing on the back of a horse." And perhaps another quote from the goddess Hekate herself, "If you speak to me often, you will perceive everything in lion form. For neither does the curved mass of heaven appear then, nor do the stars shine. The light of the moon is hidden, and the earth is not firmly secured, but everything is seen by flashes of lightning," which reminds us of the Heraclitus fragment that lightning steers all things. Perhaps one of the most interesting of all the fragments in the oracles, fragment 148, "But when you see the formless, very holy fire shining by leaps and bounds throughout the depth of the whole world, listen to the voice of the fire." Fire, also being the once transcendent god of the oracles, makes this reference to the fire with a voice particularly interesting in the context of ritual divination. Yet another strange and riddling image in the oracles is the seven-rayed god. But if I should touch upon the ineffable mystical doctrine which the Chaldeans spoke in a divine frenzy concerning the seven-rayed god we hear in Proclus, that god through whom he causes souls to ascend, I would be saying unknowable things. Yes, certainly unknowable to the herd, but well known to the blessed theurgists. On the function of time and temporality in the visionary experience, fragment 195 speaks of being linked to the zones. But the theurgists have praised time as a god, the one time god they praise as linked to the zones, the other as independent of zones. Are these two time gods Aeon, who also rules in the ethereal realm, and Hupazokos? This seems worth exploring through a closer study of the oracles. One of the main goals of the Ascent for the oracles is to arrive at, finally, the court open to all. That is the paternal order of the Father, which welcomes and contains all the souls that have returned on high. And it is significant at the very beginning of the Ascent, the oracles enjoin us to operate the magic wheels of Hekate, whose ineffable power opens up the space for the very possibility of the theurgic ascent. We also get in the oracles a number of direct statements from the goddess Hekate herself, such as when she asks us, Why, from the eternally coursing ether, do you need to invoke me, the goddess Hekate, by constraints which bind the gods? And again she says, I have come, hearkening to your very eloquent prayer, which the nature of mortals has discovered at the suggestion of the gods. And in fragment 224, Hekate advises us in very specific details of a ritual we should perform in order to animate the very statue of Hekate. The goddess speaks, but execute my statue, purifying it as I shall instruct you. Make a form from wild rue and decorate it with small animals, such as lizards, which live about the house. Rub a mixture of myrrh, gum, and frankincense with these animals, and out in the clear air under the waxing moon, complete this statue yourself while offering the following prayer. If you think that we've gone way far out of the realm of philosophy and into ritual and magic, with these later Neoplatonists, think again. In Porphyry, Iamblichus, Damascus, and Proclus, among others, we simply don't find a strict distinction between religious practices, inner experiences, and philosophical assent. Porphyry respected the oracles and often quotes them, but it is in Iamblichus and Proclus that we see an intensifying interest in the Chaldean oracles. Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, key for the foundations of Christian theology, especially important to Eastern Orthodox theology to the present day, may not have read the Chaldean oracles themselves, but his thinking is full of insights from them mediated through his reading of Proclus. And if these topics fascinate you, for a more in-depth reading on the history of the connection of Middle to Late Platonism with mystery religions like the Chaldeans and the Orphics, you can pick up Iamblichus's text on the mysteries. And this brings us to the end of our overall introduction to Neoplatonism. I apologize for what I'm sure are numerous inaccuracies and unclear statements that crept in along the way. I'm far from a Neoplatonic scholar, but more a fascinated dilettante in these areas, and hope to have time to dive more into the primary sources, scholarship, and practices of this fascinating ancient worldview. Stay tuned for a poetic reading now of the Orphic hymn to Physis and the rest of Proclus's surviving hymns. See you next week.
O Physis, resourceful mother of all, industrious and rich divinity, oldest of all, queen, all-taming and indomitable, O lustrous ruler, ever-horned mistress of all, highest goddess, imperishable, firstborn, fabled glorifier of men, nocturnal, radiant with constellations, light-bringing, irrepressible, you move swiftly. Your steps are noiseless. O pure marshal of the gods, O end that has no end. All partake of you. You alone partake of no one. Self-fathered, hence fatherless. Virtue itself, joyous, great. You are accessible, O nurse of flowers. You lovingly mingle and twine. You lead and rule. You bring life and nourishment to all. Self-sufficient, many-named persuasion of the graces. Dyke herself, queen of heaven, queen of the earth and the sea, bitter to the vulgar, sweet to those who obey you, wise in all, giver of all, nurturing queen of all. Abundant nourishment is yours as you dissolve whatever ripens. Father and mother of all, nurturer and nurse, giver of sweet birth, O blessed one, giver of wealth of seeds and of the fever of seasons. A rich and mighty divinity, you give shape and form to all things. Eternal, setting all in motion, skilled and discreet. You are ever turning this swift stream into an unceasing eddy, flowing in all things, circular and ever-changing form. Fair-throned and precious, you alone accomplish your designs. Mighty mistress of booming thunder, you rule over those who hold the scepter. O loud roaring divinity, fearless, all-taming, destined fate, fire-breathing, you are life everlasting. You are immortal providence. You are all things to all. because you alone do. You are the all. You alone do. You bring peace and health. You bring growth to all. We hymn the many-named series of Aphrodisia and the great royal source from which all immortal winged erotis have sprung up, wishing to increase the infinite universe with birth, aroused in the souls a yearning for the earthly existence. Others, again, always supervise the multifarious courses of the wedding songs, so as to produce an immortal race of such suffering men, and all care for the works of the love-producing Cytherea. But, Goddess, for you have a far-hearing ear everywhere, whether you envelop the great heaven all around, where, as they say, you are the divine soul of the everlasting cosmos, or dwell in the aether above the rims of the 7 orbits while pouring unyielding powers forward into your series. Listen, and may you steer the toilsome course of my life, mistress, with your most righteous arrows, while putting an end to the chilly impulse of unholy desires. We hymn the light that raises man aloft, on the 9 daughters of great Zeus with splendid voices, who have rescued from the agony of this world, so hard to bear, the souls who were wandering in the depths of life through immaculate rites from intellect-awaking books, and have taught them to strive eagerly to follow the track leading beyond the deep gulf of forgetfulness, and to go pure to their kindred star from which they strayed away, when once they fell into the headland of birth, mad about material lots. But goddesses, put an end to my much agitated desire to and throw me into ecstasy through the Noric words of the wise, that the race of men without fear for the gods may not lead me astray from the most divine and brilliant path with its splendid fruit. Always draw my all-roving soul towards the holy light, away from the hubbub of the much-wandering race, heavy laden from your intellect-strengthening beehives, and everlasting glory from its mind-charming eloquence. Hearken, you gods holding the helm of holy wisdom, who have kindled an upward-leading fire. Draw to the immortals human souls who leave the dark hole behind, purified by the secret initiations of hymns. Hearken, great saviors, and grant me from the very divine books pure light, scattering the mist, so that I know well an immortal God from a man, that a demon doing cruel things may not hold me forever submerged in the streams of forgetfulness, while I am far away from the blessed ones, that a chilling penalty may not bind my soul with the fetters of life, which, fallen into the waves of cold becoming, does not want to wander all too long. But gods, leaders toward bright shining wisdom, hearken and reveal to me while hurrying to the upward leading track, the secret rites and initiations of the holy words. Hearken to me, child of Iynges, bearing Zeus, sprung forth from the paternal source and from the top of your series, male-spirited, shield-bearing, of great strength, from a mighty sire, Pallas, Tritogenia, lance-brandisher, golden-helmeted, hearken, accept this hymn, mistress, with a kind spirit. Do not just leave my words at the mercy of the winds. You, who opened the gates of wisdom trodden by the gods, and overcame the tribe of the earthly giants which fought the gods. You, who guarded the unconquerable girdle of your virginity by fleeing the desire of the amorous Hephaestus. You, who saved the heart as yet unchopped of Lord Bacchus in the vault of heaven, when he was once divided up by the hands of the Titans, and brought it to his father, in order that, through the ineffable wishes of his begetter, a new Dionysus would grow again from Semele around the cosmos. Your axe, by cutting off at the roots the heads of all-seeing Hecate's animals of passions, put asleep the process of becoming. You, who loved the revered power of the mortal awaking virtues, you, who adorned our whole life with many kinds of skills by casting noetic craftsmanship into souls, you, who obtained the Acropolis on the high-crested hill, a symbol, mistress of the top of your great series, you who loved the man-feeding land, mother of books, strongly resisting the holy desire of your father's brother, and granted the city to have your name and noble mind. There, under the top edge of the mountain, you made an olive tree sprout up as manifest sign of that battle for posterity too. Then an immense gulf stirred up from the sea, came upon the children, directed by Poseidon, lashing all things with its loud roaring streams. Give me, as I am roaming around the earth, a blessed harbor. Give my soul holy light from your sacred myths, and wisdom and love. Breathe into my love a power so great and of such a kind that it pulls me back up again from the vaults of matter to Olympus, into the abode of your Father. And if some grievous error in my life overpowers me, for I know how I am buffeted by many and various unholy actions, from different sides, offenses which I committed with a foolish spirit, be gracious, mild counseling goddess, preserver of mortals. Do not let me become prey and spoil for the horrible punishments lying on the ground. Since I profess to belong to you, give steady and propitious health to my limbs, and drive the herds of bitter flesh-wasting illnesses away. Yes, I beg you, my queen, and stop with your immortal hand the entire misery of black pains. Give calm winds to the voyage of my life, children, a spouse, fame, happiness, lovely joy, persuasion, conversations with friends, nimble wit, power against my enemies, a place of prominence among the people. Hearken, hearken, mistress, I come to you in deep supplication, through pressing necessity, and you lend me a gentle ear.